You've seen the video. Everyone has seen the video. A dog lying next to something on the side of a road, nudging it, backing off, nudging it again, waiting. And you watched it with your thumb frozen over the screen, and something in your chest did a thing it does not usually do. Or maybe it wasn't a video. Maybe it was your own cat sitting in the exact spot where the other cat used to sleep. Not near it, in it, for weeks. And the thing you told yourself, because it's the comfortable thing to tell yourself, is that the animal doesn't get it, that it's confused, that it's just waiting for a friend who isn't coming back, and the tragedy is precisely that it will never understand why. But what if that's backwards? What if some of them understand perfectly well? What if the confusion is ours? Does a crow know what a dead crow is? Does an elephant know what it's looking at when it turns a skull over with its foot? Is there a moment in a brain that is not a human brain where something clicks and the world becomes permanently one creature smaller? That question has an actual scientific name, an actual field, actual data, and the answer is stranger and more specific than either camp wants it to be. By the end of this video, I promise you, you will never look at an animal standing very still the same way again. Let's start from the very beginning. Here's something science is a little embarrassed about. For most of the 20th century, the official position was that animals do not grieve, because animals do not have anything to grieve with. This was behaviorism. Animals were biological machines. Stimulus in, response out, no interior, no lights on. A chimpanzee sitting motionless beside its dead mother wasn't sad. It was exhibiting a disruption in reinforcement patterns. There was even a rule for it. Morgan's canon, late 1800s. Never explain a behavior with a complex mental process if a simple one will do. And look, that rule exists for a good reason. Humans are pathologically eager to see ourselves in everything. We name our cars. We apologize to furniture. But here's the problem. We overcorrected. Catastrophically. For roughly 100 years, describing an animal as mourning was a career risk. It was seen as soft, naive, unserious. So the observations kept happening in the field, and the papers kept not getting written. And then, slowly, they started getting written anyway. In 2018, a review in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B did something quietly radical. It gave the whole subject a name: comparative thanatology. The scientific study of how non-human animals respond to death. The field exists now. The data is in. And it turns out animals are doing a lot more than we thought. Like, a lot more. Let's start with the ones who figured it out about 100 million years before us. Ants. An ant colony has a corpse disposal system so efficient it looks like paperwork. A worker dies, and within a day or two, another worker picks it up and carries it to a refuse pile outside the nest. Clean, fast, unsentimental. So how does the living ant know the dead one is dead? It doesn't check for breathing. It doesn't look at the body at all. It smells a chemical, oleic acid, which accumulates in an ant's corpse after death. E.O. Wilson tested this in the most gloriously petty experiment in the history of entomology. He took a living, healthy, perfectly functional ant and daubed a tiny amount of oleic acid on it. Its nestmates picked it up and carried it to the graveyard. The ant struggled. The ant was obviously alive. Didn't matter. They dumped it on the corpse pile. It cleaned itself off, walked back in, and got carried straight back out, over and over until the smell wore off. Now, that is not understanding death. That is a smoke detector. It is a single molecule triggering a single subroutine in a nervous system with fewer neurons than a rounding error, and it tells us something genuinely important before we go any further. An animal can respond to death with total reliability and absolutely zero comprehension. The behavior can look purposeful, organized, almost ceremonial, and be running on nothing at all. Death, for an ant, is a scent. It is not a fact. It is not an event. It is a smell that means carry this out, in exactly the way a red light means stop to a car that has no opinion about traffic. Hold on to that because it is the exact thing the skeptics are going to point at later, and when they do, they are going to have a point. And while we're here, it's worth noticing that the ants figured out something else. Death is useful information, which means it's also a weapon. There's a lizard, the opossum, the hognose snake, roughly 200 documented species that fake it, and they don't just lie there and hope. An opossum in full thanatosis is involuntarily unconscious, mouth open, tongue out, and leaking a foul-smelling fluid from its rear that mimics the chemistry of a rotting corpse. It has evolved a full costume, which tells you that somewhere on the other end of that arrangement, there is a predator whose brain has a category called already dead, not worth it. Death registers across the animal kingdom as a state you can read. The only question is how deep the reading goes. So let's go somewhere the smoke detector explanation starts to break down. Crows. A crow finds a dead crow on the ground, and it does not quietly carry it away. It screams. And then the other crows come, dozens of them, and they scream too, and they gather around the body in a mob, and then they leave. People have been calling these crow funerals for centuries, which is exactly the kind of language that made 20th century scientists break out in hives. So in 2015, Kaylee Swift and John Marsluff at the University of Washington actually tested it. Here's the design, and it's beautiful. They had a volunteer stand in a Seattle neighborhood wearing a distinctive mask, holding a dead crow. Crows arrived. Crows screamed. Fine. Expected. But then they checked what the crows did afterward. The birds didn't just mob the person. They remembered the mask. They remembered the place. For days afterward, those crows were dramatically more reluctant to come down and feed at that spot, even with food sitting right there, even with no dead crow in sight, even with no person in sight. They weren't reacting to a body. They were extracting information from it and then acting on that information days later, in a place, about a face, with no corpse anywhere in the frame. A dead crow, to a crow, is not a tragedy, and it is not a scent. It's intelligence, in the espionage sense of the word. It's a data point that says something in this location kills things that look exactly like me, and I am going to update my entire map of the neighborhood accordingly, and I am going to hold that update for a long, long time. That's not a reflex. That's not a chemical trigger. That is a wild animal treating a corpse as evidence about its own future. And here's the kicker. Swift ran a follow-up with a dead pigeon instead of a dead crow, and the response dropped off sharply. It had to be one of them. The category is not dead thing. The category is dead crow, which means somewhere in a brain the size of a walnut, there is a distinction being drawn between us and them at the exact moment of maximum stress, which is more than most people manage in a group chat. Marsluff's team also did the obvious follow-up that nobody wants to think about and put crows in a scanner. The brain region that lit up around a dead crow wasn't a generic alarm center. It was the area associated with higher-order decision-making and learning. They weren't panicking at the body. They were thinking about it. Now let's talk about the ones that keep the bodies. In 2018, an orca off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, catalog designation J35, known as Tahlequah, gave birth to a calf that lived for about 30 minutes. She did not let it sink. A newborn orca calf is a couple hundred pounds and has no buoyancy once it's dead, which means every single time it slipped off her, she had to dive, retrieve it, and push it back up to the surface with her head. She did that for 17 days, roughly 1,000 miles. She wasn't eating properly. Her pod stayed with her the entire time, and at points other whales appeared to take turns carrying the calf so she could rest. 17 days. Consider what that requires. Not a moment of confusion, but sustained, exhausting, physically punishing, weeks-long refusal. Let that sink in for a second. You do not carry something for 1,000 miles because you don't understand that it's gone. You carry it for 1,000 miles because on some level you understand exactly what letting go means. And this isn't a one-off. Marine biologists have now documented this corpse-carrying behavior across roughly 20 species of cetaceans. Mothers supporting dead calves, adults circling the body of an adult, groups moving at the speed of the slowest, most burdened member and not leaving. Now, here's where things get genuinely fascinating and a little uncomfortable. Elephants. Elephants are the ones that broke the biological machine model in half. They return to the bones of the dead, not as a myth, as a documented, repeatable, measured behavior. In 2006, Karen McComb and her team ran a study in Amboseli, Kenya, that I still think about. They laid out 3 objects for wild elephant families: a piece of wood, a rhino skull, and an elephant skull. The elephants went for the elephant skull. Consistently. Overwhelmingly. Not wood, not rhino, theirs. They explored it with their trunks, with their feet, lingering over it in a way they did not linger over anything else. They didn't need a body. They didn't need a smell. Years after the flesh was gone, a piece of bone still carried the category. This was one of us. Elephants have also been observed covering their dead with branches and dirt, and they've been observed doing it for dead humans. Read that again. A species that has every possible evolutionary reason to want us gone has been documented performing the same behavior it performs for its own family, on us. That is not a reflex. That is not self-preservation. That is a category that includes death, includes identity, and apparently sometimes includes you. And then there are the chimps, who are the closest we get to watching ourselves from the outside. In 2010, James Anderson and colleagues published something unusual, a filmed, documented account of an elderly chimpanzee named Pansy dying of natural causes in a Scottish safari park, surrounded by her group. The behavior in the hours around her death looks upsettingly familiar. The others groomed her. They examined her repeatedly, checking her face, her mouth. When she stopped moving, her daughter stayed with the body all night. And then, for days afterward, the group would not sleep on the platform where she died. There's also footage from Bossou, Guinea, of a chimpanzee named Noel, sitting with the body of a young chimp she had adopted, selecting a stem of grass with what looks like consideration, and using it to clean his teeth, slowly, carefully, grooming a mouth that was never going to eat again, for an audience that no longer existed. Nobody has a good mechanical explanation for that. There's no reinforcement on offer. There's no reciprocity coming. The dead do not groom you back, and every calorie spent on a corpse is a calorie taken from a body that still needs them, which means natural selection should have deleted this behavior a very long time ago, and it did not. And then there's Flint. Jane Goodall watched a young chimp at Gombe named Flint lose his mother, Flo, in 1972. He was around 8 years old enough to feed himself, old enough to survive. He stopped traveling with the group. He climbed into a tree, to an old nest they had shared, and sat there. He stopped eating. He stopped socializing. He went back to the spot on the stream bank where Flo's body had been, and he stayed near it, and roughly 3.5 weeks after she died, so did he. The postmortem found no injury that explained it. Goodall was blunt about what she thought had happened, and she was blunt about it in an era when saying it out loud cost her. You can call that a disruption in reinforcement patterns if you want. You can use those words, but everybody in that sentence knows what actually happened to Flint. Okay? Let's pause here and address the skeptic in the room, because the argument is real and it deserves respect. Here it is. None of this proves comprehension. An orca carrying a calf for 17 days might not be grieving. It might be running a bonding program that simply has no off switch, because in 3 million years of evolution, it never needed one. Maternal attachment is one of the strongest drives in mammalian biology. It doesn't come with a check if the baby is dead instruction. So it just runs, painfully, uselessly, for 1,000 miles. The crows might not understand mortality at all. They might just be reading a danger signal that happens to be crow-shaped. Remember the ants. Remember that you can produce perfect death-related behavior with a single molecule and no mind whatsoever. And the elephant with the skull might not be remembering a friend. It might just find ivory interesting, and there's a version of that story where nothing is going on inside at all. Every one of those objections is legitimate. Every one of them is unfalsifiable from the outside. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But here's where it gets complicated. Comparative thanatologists tend to break understanding death into components, and this is where it stops being one question and becomes five. Irreversibility. Dead things don't come back. Cessation. Dead things stop doing all functions. Universality. Everything dies. Causality. Things die because of causes. Personal mortality, including you. Humans don't get all five at once, by the way, which is the detail that quietly detonates the whole debate. Children assemble those concepts piece by piece over years, somewhere between about 4 and 10 years old. And they get them in a rough order, and they get some of them badly wrong for a surprisingly long time. A 5-year-old will typically accept that grandma is not coming back and simultaneously ask whether she gets cold down there. Irreversibility arrives before cessation. Universality arrives late. Personal mortality, the one where you turn the concept around and point it at yourself, arrives last of all, and for a lot of adults, it never quite finishes arriving at all. So the honest framing is that understanding death is not a switch that a mind either has or doesn't have. It's a stack, and the human stack is the tallest one we've measured. But it is assembled out of the same components we're now finding in pieces, in animals that split off from us tens of millions of years ago. So the question was never, do animals understand death? That question is badly built. The real question is, which pieces, in which species, and how many? And when you ask it that way, the picture clarifies fast. The ant has 0. The crow appears to have causality, and clearly has something like irreversibility, because it does not go back to that place. The orca appears to be fighting cessation with everything she has, which is not what confusion looks like. The elephant, standing over a skull it has not seen in years, is running some form of identity and permanence at the same time. And we genuinely do not know how far up that ladder any of them go. Not because we haven't looked. Because there is no instrument that reaches inside another mind. That is not a temporary problem. That may be a permanent one. Let's bring this back down to earth, to something personal. The reason this question hits so hard, the reason you're watching a video about dead crows at 2 in the morning isn't scientific curiosity. It's this. We are the species that made death into a story. We have rituals, coffins, hymns, headstones, 100,000 years of trying to make the fact survivable by wrapping it in meaning. And underneath all of it is a suspicion we don't say out loud, that the story is a coping mechanism, that we built the cathedral because we could not stand the silence. And so when you see an elephant covering a body with branches, something in you goes very quiet, because either that animal is doing something meaningless, and maybe so are we, or it isn't. And we are so much less alone than we were told. The evidence, imperfect and unfinished as it always is, points somewhere genuinely astonishing. Not that animals grieve the way we do. They don't. Not that they philosophize about mortality on a savanna somewhere. They don't. But in a real, measurable, reproducible, behaviorally observable way, the fact of death registers. It is noticed. It changes what happens next. The crow avoids the place for days. The whale carries the weight for 1,000 miles. The chimp will not sleep where her mother stopped. The elephant chooses her own kind's bone out of 3 every single time. None of that is nothing. None of that is coincidence. None of that is biology being accidentally poetic. That is a mind meeting the hardest fact there is and doing something with it. So here's what I'd leave you with. Go back to that dog on the roadside. Nudging. Backing off. Waiting. We've been telling ourselves that story wrong the whole time. The comfort was supposed to be that he doesn't understand. That's the version where his heart stays intact. But watch him again. Watch how he stops nudging eventually. Watch how he sits down. He's not waiting. He's staying. And there is no version of that where nobody's home.